All right. Well, let's get started now. So welcome everybody. Uh, I am Pastor Joe Sheeran of Woodland Park Presbyterian Church in Seattle, Washington, and delighted to welcome all of you to this live conversation about how broad-based community organizing animates Christian faith. Tonight's going to be a night of a lot of firsts. This is our first time trying this kind of conversational program with this kind of format, this hour, and this subject. So I speak for myself. I'm really excited for where this is going to go. I hope that this can bring important learning for the future. Just that kind of experiment about different ways to connect with scholars and experts and leaders in our community and around the country and perhaps even the globe to share stories and learn about ways that we can grow in our faith. Um, as I said, my name is Joe Sheeran. I serve as pastor of Woodland Park Presbyterian. Looks mostly my congregants here, so most of you know who I am. But uh, prior to coming to Woodland Park, prior to coming to Seattle, I was a hospital chaplain in suburban Detroit and Chicago. Before that, graduate student and sometimes organizer, sometimes political hack in Nashville, which is where I met Aaron. I'm a cradle Presbyterian, like many of you, and grew up in a purplish suburban community in a purplish home church that, while we definitely had some real concrete, specific material ways that we lived out our faith, we also sometimes struggled with addressing the moments that we found ourselves in a united and clear kind of way, and struggled with doing more than speaking from pulpits, so to speak. Um, this left me hungry for a way to live out my faith in the kind of way that heroes of faith, the kind of people that we write books. I think about my father's Catholic picture book, Lives of the Saints. That kind of material commitment of being all in, that is hard to imagine doing in this day and age. But that led me to this journey of faith that's brought me to Woodland Park, um, and is part of the why of our class tonight. So Woodland Park, we've got someone from Northminster here. I don't know if other folks will be watching this later, but we're here in Seattle. We're North Seattle. It's a little bit of a mixture of urban and suburban. We've got a lot of uh, different backgrounds, but we're of a kind, I would say, for the most part, socioeconomically, and it can be hard to get outside of our bubble, hard to form those relationships and connections, and hard to imagine ways to engage in the world around us beyond voting, activism, and lobbying our elected leaders, which is part of the why of this class. Is there's another option, which is to build power through organizing connections, to really put that faith practice of reaching out to a neighbor into something that begins to go somewhere. I want to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but first I want to introduce Aaron. Aaron, you are a scholar. You have a PhD from Union Theological Seminary, and you've been living in Nashville for a while. You are. I thought I heard the other day that you were a professor. I know you're a program staff. You're director of the Wendland Cook Institute for Religion and Justice, and you've been overseeing a lot of great programs for pastors and community activists to be in conversation together. Aaron's dropped the link in the chat. We'll include that later, religionandjustice.org. But first, before I talk and keep going on and on, I'd love to hear who's Aaron in
Yeah.
your own words.
Yeah, I really appreciate this, Joe. I mean, I think beginning with these stories is so important, right? Because I think oftentimes you don't get to that until sometimes years down the road. Why it is that someone is where they are, why they fell in love with something in the first place. I grew up in a small town in Kansas, town about 5,000 people. The church was the center of community life there. And I didn't realize at first until, probably until I was later in college, how much that church taught me. Not only about theology, but also about power. So, for example, if I wanted to get something done at the congregation, I didn't go to the pastor. Sorry, Joe. I went to Sally, because Sally had been there for 40 years. Sally was the matriarch. Sally, knew everything about the church. And furthermore, in her identity, she was First Presbyterian Church of Iowa, Kansas, right? She held the story of the church, of the commitment to the community, of their love for justice, of their commitment to service. But on a more pragmatic level too, the pastor worked for Sally. The pastor worked for the session. So there is a real, point here about both how power works relationally and how our institutions embody those relationships in ways that are good, right? That they should be that way. So I learned a lot from that small town church. I learned a lot about community, a lot about power, a lot about my love for theology. I went to college up in Minnesota, and after a couple of years of volunteering in the community, I joined the young adult volunteer program that brought me down to San Antonio, Texas. So if you all are Presbyterian, which I assume the majority of you are, maybe you know about the YAV program, and it's just a wonderful program that really filled my life, and it threw me into the heart of organizing in San Antonio, Texas. I didn't really know what I was doing, but all good experiences are like that, right? All of a sudden you kind of fall into it, and then it breaks you down and builds you up. That's what seminary does, is it breaks you down and builds you up. And I loved it. It showed me the point really where people were taking their faith into action. I think we are consistently, whether we reflect on it or not, confronted with this chasm between the way the world is and the way that it ought to be. Our faith traditions provide us with many different bridges that allow us to walk from the way that it is to the way that it ought to be. But oftentimes we don't know how to walk that. We don't know how to walk the talk. We don't know how to enact justice. We don't know how to build power. We are fearful. The bridge is up too high, the chasm too deep, the wind too strong. There are things that make the work too difficult. But our faith traditions provide us with handholds and guides to help us walk across that bridge. And so I left organizing because I wanted a deeper theological vocabulary. I don't want to go too long here, Joe, so I'll wrap up here. But I wanted a deeper understanding for why it is that people feel called to move the world from the way that it is to the way that it ought to be. And I particularly remember this in two distinct stories. The first is that as I had some experience organizing, I was leading a congregation through a Bible study of the book of Exodus. Principally, I think it was Exodus 13 here, where Moses is, out in the wilderness, and he's standing as a judge for all the ancient Israelites, and they continue to come to him day after day, hour after hour. The line is forever. It's long. It's never stopping. They need him to adjudicate. They need him to judge on these issues. And Jethro, his father-in-law, eventually comes out there, cuts in line, and says, "What are you doing? You haven't seen my daughter. You haven't seen my kid. You haven't seen your kid in days. You need to delegate. You need to get out there. You need to set up and find and identify other leaders. This cannot be you alone." And that is such a strong passage, because I think that's so reflective of our leadership culture in churches, which is that we think we need to do it all. You're the chair of the committee. You're the one who's going to write the report. You're the one who's going to give the sermon. When the pastor's gone, you're the one who's going to do pulpit supply. That's not healthy. That's not going to work. You're going to burn out. You can't do it all. Jethro says so. The Bible says so. Well, so I'm stoked and on fire about this, right? Clearly, this is a great message, and I bring it to this organizer and I say, "Hey, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring this church to it." And he goes, "You know what? This is great, except for the fact that if you want to do theology, go get a theologian. Organizing is about building power."
Hmm.
And I thought this was such an odd thing to say because clearly, sure, organizing is about building power. We can get more into this, what is power and things like that. But so is theology. Theology is distinctly about power. It's about God. Theology, theologos, words about God. What is more powerful than God? Right? That is the ultimate power, sovereign and providential. Let's do some good reformed theology here. So I do think that part of what set me off of organizing, continued this going forward, was some of the problems that I found in organizers and their preconceived notions of the role of theology. And this is the final story here, right? Because this is what happened then too after I had, gone to seminary, finished my MDiv, and I continued to do my PhD, and I moved down here to Nashville to do some interfaith organizing. I ran an anti-Islamophobia program here for about 5 years, and one of the churches that I was organizing with did a listening campaign. This is a time-limited series of interviews. Maybe some of y'all may be familiar with this. Interviews is a bad way to talk about it, but it's the simplest form for us to kind of think about it in. And as the pastor was then inviting people to come to our review session about our accountability session, we brought the Metro council person to say, we've done our research. We know the issues. We know the values. This is what our congregation cares about. We're going to pay attention. And as he was introducing it, he said, "Now, I just want to make sure y'all know this is not a political meeting." And my jaw dropped. I said, and I called him after. I said, "What? Why did you say it's not a political meeting?" And he said, some of my congregants were saying that we were encouraging people to vote for a particular partisan person. And I said, that's partisanship. That's not politics. Politics is about the contestation and negotiation of the goods that we hold in common: healthcare, education, right? Transportation, childcare. These are goods that we hold in common, and Christianity cares deeply about those things. We're not telling people to vote for the DNC or the RNC here. We're talking about just politics. And so I wrote this book. I'm having these conversations with folk. I do this work because I think there are, on both sides of it, within churches and within organizing networks, hurdles that people have not been able, that trip people up around the relationship between religion and politics, that prevent them from building the kingdom of God, from understanding how it is that the gospel calls us to transform the structures of society in the directions of justice. That's what it means to apply the ethic of Jesus. I'll end there, Joe.
And I so appreciate the resonance between your story about that council person meeting where the pastor stood up and said, "This isn't political," and
Mm-hmm.
how that resonates with my home church,
Yeah.
which believed that the way to be faithful about politics was to sort of be purple, right?
Mm-hmm.
To try not to speak too directly to anything that had been polarized, but that the upshot of that was we also had a hard time speaking directly about anything and really owning when we were speaking, right? Owning when our faith did tell us to act. And
Yeah.
owning when it was time to wield power, right? Each of
Yeah.
us has power as an individual. Some of us have power through our associations.
Uh-huh.
One of the things that I remember from when I first encountered community organizing was the kind of I'm gonna bungle the mantra, but the concept of building power through two ways: organizing money
Yeah.
and organizing people.
Yeah, that's right.
So tell us a little bit more about organizing as building power through people, because I think we probably have a
Mm-hmm.
pretty good handle on how it works when you're organizing power, you're building power through organizing money. So what's the
Yeah.
alternative here?
No, that's exactly right. Yeah, the adage is power is achieved by organizing people and organizing money, right? You need both. Oftentimes people forget that you need both. You can have all the people in the streets in front of the city courthouse, but if you don't actually have the resources to then sustain or build an organization or build an institution, it kind of falls apart. It's brittle. It can't sustain it. But also then if you only have the money, you don't have the people, then the money is rootless. It's sort of floating. It's superficial in that way. It's not grounded in real people's experiences. So broad-based organizing, broadly conceived here, is a form of community transformation, where it is that people come together by identifying the values that they hold most dear and what it is that they're willing to protect and fight for, right? So, and this is distinct here from the issues, right? So one way to think about this is, or an issue or a value, or an issue or a problem. Problems are oftentimes what it is that we do, what it is we try to encounter or counter or to change, right? Because they're big, they're attractive, they take up a lot of space in our political imagination, right? When I first started organizing, it's always one of the way that I was taught was that it's easier to get people into a fight because it's in the front of people's minds to get them to solve the global AIDS epidemic. But also, like, individuals, since I was in San Antonio, individuals in San Antonio, Texas are not going to solve the global AIDS epidemic. Like, this is not going to happen. Like the individual agency there is not, there's no,
The
there's no
problem's too
real,
big. You
right,
can't do
exactly.
it by
Yeah,
yourself.
exactly. 100%. But you can get a stop sign in your street. You can get some speed bumps put there. You can get a living wage passed in your city. And so the question is here is understanding one's agency, right? As you said, the problem is too big. Being able to get your hands around it, right? What is your capacity? Power is best defined as the ability to act with efficacy, right? It's the ability to act with efficacy. So, and in this way, power is relational. The typical understanding of power that we have in popular media are like the bully, the tyrant, the boss. These are top-down understandings of power rather than relational.
Well, and those top-down understandings of power are not necessarily efficacious, right? Like
Yeah,
it's like I love that word, efficacy. Like
yeah.
if I say, um, Todd, as pastor and moderator of session, I need you to format your report differently, and I need the meeting to include these items, and we're gonna figure out when we're gonna do them. Please handle. Um, if Todd's not on board with that model, with that plan, Todd has lots of means of opposing that, right?
Yeah.
And so it's one thing for me to say, I'm the pastor and we're gonna do this,
Oh,
but
this is great,
if I
Joe.
don't
Yeah.
have that relationship, if I don't have something to actually make it happen, there's authority, but there's not power,
This is
right?
exactly right. And that relationship is crucial, right? You need to have earned leadership then. One way to think of, and this is what makes you a leader then, is if you have earned the authority from others to lead. Earning the authority does not come easily, right? And this is why I use Sally at the beginning of it. She spent 40 years in that church. Right? Sally's a real person, friends. It may seem like a random name, but it's no, she's still there. So maybe it's 60 years that she's been there now, but it's real. I just got a call from my mom the other day. So it's real. But this important, the idea of it being a relationship is really important because, Todd, we're just going to pick on you again. You have agency here. You have voice. You have say. That is about power. It takes a lot more power than to receive something than it does merely to exert an output. That's force, right? This is the idea of receiving a punch, right? Rather than just giving it. It takes a lot more power to receive that. So what broad-based organizing does is it builds organizations that understand power. They understand the relationships in their context.
When you say organizations, you mean like
Yeah, this is great. So broad-based organizing was started, and this form of community transformation, of community change, right, was started in 1939 by Saul Alinsky in the Back of the Yards neighborhood in Chicago. Now, maybe some of y'all have heard of him. Perhaps you heard of him when President Obama was first running for president, and people discovered that he was an organizer in Chicago, and everybody said that he organized for the communist, Saul Alinsky. So that maybe is how you heard him, right? Saul Alinsky was a Jew, and he really started organizing in the late 40s or the early, the late 30s, early 40s to prevent, the Nazis succeeding and fascism succeeding in the United States. So there's a real existential reason here, right? And there are four national networks of broad-based organizing. And perhaps some of you all, I don't know if you have one you do have one in Seattle. You have an Industrial Areas Foundation network in Seattle, right? Which is Sound Alliance, if my memory serves me. So you have a network there. And so the Industrial Areas Foundation is national in scope, and it has local city affiliates, right? Constituencies in each different city that it has memberships. And there are three other national organizations that do this: Faith in Action, Gamaliel, which is the one that Obama organized for, and DART, Direct Action Resource and Training. So the trick about here is that the IAF, Industrial Areas Foundation, will support Sound Alliance in both finances and training and resources and knowledge and people, right? It will send you an organizer who is a deeply experienced person who understands power, knows how to build organizations and institutions. And an organization in this way, an affiliate of the IAF, is an organization of organizations. Woodland Park can join. Pastor Joe cannot. Why is this the case? Because it understands that power is institutional and relational in this way, which means you have to organize people. You need to bring people together, to mobilize them and put them through an educational process, both about various issues and about themselves. This work is really about, one way to think about it, it's about discipleship. It's about understanding what it means to walk and live into the ethics of Jesus and grow into the life of faith in a way that really understands what it means to live into that ethic. It's about character. It's about certain personality, about being curious and being loving, being angry at times, which Jesus was. We see each of these in various moments in the scriptures.
And if I could interrupt you there, one thing I haven't heard you say yet is self-interest, which is a word that I know comes up a lot in organizing conversations. You mentioned Alinsky's motivation for organizing in the late 30s, early 40s, being about
stopping fascism,
anti-Semitism, opposing the rise of fascism.
Yeah.
Some of what you're talking about just now strikes me as being a kind of Christian self-interest, right? We have this faith that urges us to connect in a way, but when you walk into an organizing room, when you walk into a broad-based community organizing conversation, it's very much about who are you, what are your connections, what motivates you, right? And you were starting to get at that, but the thread I was hearing was self-interest. So how does that work in a local coalition like COPS or Sound Alliance?
This is really important because I think for the way that organizing really begins is that you have an organizer or a pastor or somebody, a leader, say, I want to get coffee with you. I want to do a one-on-one, right? A relational meeting. And oftentimes what they'll do is that they'll sit down and they'll, get to know you, get to know your story. But here's where I think things are often missed, which is that I think that people will turn it either into an interview where they'll go through a set of questions kind of about things, right? But never really, you'll talk around the issue, around the person. You won't actually talk to the person, or you won't actually listen to the person. You'll kind of have a set of questions that you think you need to get through, rather than actually letting the Spirit move you. say. So what tends to happen, a relational meeting is a time-limited, intentional, value-directed, and story-directed conversation, right? You're sitting down in a public place, probably a coffee shop or something like that, and you're going to talk to, say, Alan, why is it that you go to Woodland Park? What first brought you there? All right, so, okay, so tell me more about those stories. All right, so what has kept you there? All right, so I hear that these are some of the values that you most cherish. All right, well, who taught you? Why do you care about those values? Where did you first learn that? So what happens is that then the person who's having these sorts of conversations is curious about the whys and the hows, right? Not necessarily the what. I want to know the stories. Why? Because I'm curious about the values. Because it's the values, it's the stories of love and liberation that throw us into social justice fights in the first place. I have two kids, a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, 15-month-old. I am deeply concerned about the quality of schools in Nashville and the price of childcare. Why? Yeah, they're expensive and the schools are not so great, but also because I love my kids to death. That's why. Because Julian and August mean the world to me. That's what it's about. And I will fight for them because I love Julian and August. Not only because I'm angry about the other things, but instead because of those values. Those values get concretized in particular issues, right? That change, that move. Julian and August will grow. They will have different sorts of challenges and have different needs that I, as a dad, will need to care for. So the issues will change. So my self-interest, right, which when you break it down in the Latin here, is about inter esse, right? Self among others. That's what it's really about. It's about how it is that the values and the issues connect and how the issues and the connect you to others. So it's not about selfishness. Self-interest is not selfishness. Self-interest is about having clarity of the values that you care most about and how it is that they are concretized in the issues that present themselves to the organization that you're working with.
So you and Alan have this conversation about self-interest. You have this conversation about the
Yeah,
values to self and others.
yeah,
Then what happens is you've mentioned that organizing with broad-based community organization of organizations.
yeah,
Alan's one individual. What happens after that?
yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that organizing is a slow and patient process, right? Probably what happens is that, all right, so let's say one of two things really happen. Either Alan and I have a bad conversation and it doesn't go well. And I go, okay, all right, well, I got to have another one-on-one, and we keep on going. Or what typically happens is I say, all right, Alan, who else should I talk to? Who else, who else do you think cares about these issues in the way that you do? Or who else at your church is a leader, right? Who has the respect of the rest of the community? Who's the Sally, right? And then so Alan will then maybe introduce me to others, and then I'll talk to other people, and then eventually we'll get to a pretty big group, and then we'll say, okay, all right, Woodland Park, now we've talked to a lot of people. Maybe we should get outside of Woodland Park and talk to Northminster, right, Antonio? Let's talk to Northminster. Let's see what y'all are doing over there. What's your context like? What's your community like? Do you majority of your people of your lay leaders of your congregants, do they commute in? Do they live by the neighborhood? Does your church building own the land yet? What's going on? Let's explore a little bit. What's going on in Seattle? What's the public transportation like? What is the issues here? What do people care about? Let's just start talking to others. This is a long exploratory curious process, about a year and a half that you're first doing this. Now, Sound Alliance has already done this. Don't worry, like this is if you're starting at the new, but basically you just have to start talking to people. You have to start talking to people and get to knowing them and build those relationships. Why? Because you got to earn the trust. Because if you want to act in solidarity with people, people have to know that you're in it for the long haul and not just in it for the instrumental fashion. right? And this is again, like we're maintaining a pretty political level here, but if we want to dive pretty deep really quickly, this is about what it means to live out Christian faith. This is not just about a political candidate. This is about who you are as a Christian and who God is calling you as a church to be out in public. So when you're in the one-on-one, I want to like stop on this theological point here because this is super important, right? When you're in the one-on-one and I'm talking with Alan, and Alan shares with me stories about, say, how his grandparents first informed him about what it was like to go to Woodland Park. I'm making this up, Alan, right? And we're talking a little bit about that. There's an appropriate level of vulnerability that I have to pause for and that I need to attend to him. I need to love him as a Christian, as only a Christian can. Because it is about honoring him and his stories and hearing that and discerning together the way that God is calling us into deeper relationship together and then out into public. The Spirit moves in a spiral movement. God moves us closer together and then outward, right? God moves us internally to then discern who we are and who we ought to be, collectively and individually. And then we go out and do the work of proclamation and evangelism. And this is why good Reformed theology is all about listening first and then responding. God's initiative first. Thank goodness, faith is a gift. God has given this to us, and then we move forward, and then we respond. You hear the word first before you hear Pastor Joe speak. Why? Because you need to hear the word and then you need to appropriately respond. This is the same thing with a one-on-one. You listen first. You attend to others. You attend to the way that the Spirit is moving. I see you wanting to jump in here. Just give me a second. And then you move forward. So part of what that movement does, it's a very spiritual process. Partly because we're just not taught in this culture to actually listen to each other, especially listening to those that we are deeply different from, or that we perceive that we are deeply different from. You may know somebody for 40 years, but do you really know why they're there? Do you really listen? When was the last time that you really listened? And when was the last time that you asked the question, how is it that God is calling us to move in different ways? Once you've done that, then you do the perhaps easier work of building a political coalition, which is saying, hey, you know what? God is calling us to do this. Are y'all down?
So take us through the and just to clarify, when you said listening as only Christian can, you're talking about listening from that heart of our faith, right? Not that other people don't listen, but that when we're
Yes.
listening as a Christian person, that we're kind of fitting the other person into that lens of our spiritual understanding, right? We have
Yeah,
this image of God, child of God, that we're listening in that perspective. And then once we, as you were just beautifully describing, once we have that intimacy, once we have that
yes.
understanding and that trust on a individual to individual level, and then within a congregation, right? If we're talking about churches,
Yeah.
or within a labor union, within
Yeah.
another kind of community group, how do you then, as you were saying, how do you then go about to building a coalition through broad-based community organizing? How does that work?
Yeah.
What does that accomplish?
Yeah. So the theological point here is crucial. I do believe that the church is called to this work. Why? Because I think that the church is best identified by its task. The church is certainly not a building, and the church is not only about people, right? Because there are lots of other people around who call themselves Christians that don't look like the sort of Christian that I identify with, right? There are lots of Christian nationalists out there that I think you're not practicing the same sort of Christianity that I'm practicing. And so because of that, I see the work of the church as primarily constituted by work of love and liberation, and building relationships of love and liberation. What does that look like? That often looks like the Sermon on the Mount. That looks like Luke 4, right? Setting free the oppressed and bringing good news to the poor, right? This is a solid social, ethical motivation to the faith here. The church is called and best identified by the task, right, of building relationships of liberation and love. So wherever you see the work of liberation and love being done, there is the church. That's where the church is. So, yes, that's what I mean by the way that only a Christian can. Like, certainly, Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists all have deeply ethical teachings that provide them with crucial ways that can listen to each other only in the way that they can. So, you're absolutely right there, Joe.
Well, and that's part of the power of broad-based community organizing is that we bring those different traditions together, right?
Yeah.
We bring those traditions together along with community organizations, along with labor organizations to from those multiple lenses arrive at how is it that we're going to do those tasks that are too big for
Hmm.
congregations who work that's too big for an individual. How are we going to do those tasks that are too big for a congregation, right?
That's
Because
exactly right. Yeah.
unless you're Billy Graham with a congregation of millions, it's pretty
That's
hard
right.
to get things
Yeah.
done.
Yeah. Right. So then what's the process of building an organization, right? Okay. Well, if you're going to build an affiliate, first of all, you've got to have a number of different congregations or a number of different institutions, labor unions, schools, PTAs, community groups that are interested in joining, that are interested in confederating in this way. But one of the best way that you can actually do that is, and then you have to enter into the complicated process then of bringing everyone together, going through the process of having an issues assembly where each of you bring everybody. Say you've done all these house meetings the first year and you've got, say, 500 people, 1,000 people that you've talked to, and you bring them into a big assembly, and then you identify the core issues that each of your individual institutions hold, and then you decide on them. Then you build committees to address and research and educate and take action on each of these different issues. But you don't get to that campaign, the issue campaign level, unless you've done the first thing, which is that you need to build a core team. You need to find your team and your congregation, a team of 5, say, a team of 7, that are committed to this work. And what is this work? Sure, in theological terms, it's the work of building liberation and love, of actually, enacting the ethics of Jesus, of living out your faith, of growing as disciples of Christ. But partly what this means too is it means doing basic human and leadership development, which is like if I'm having with a conversation with Alan, I, as the person running this sort of conversation, I'm looking for a couple of things in Alan. I want to know how curious he is.
Hmm.
I want to know, like, does he ask questions about things, or does he just kind of accept things the way they are? I want to know, how does he feel about power? So I'll probably ask him, how do you feel about power? And then maybe he'll kind of be like, well, what do you mean? Like, if you were me, then that's exactly like, that's what I said when I was first asked about this when I was 21. I was like, I don't know. What do you mean? Power can be good or bad. Well, in this way, no. If power is defined as the capacity to act with efficacy, then yeah, it's a good thing, right? We need more of it. We are consistently taught that it's something that we should not have. Why? Similar to anger in this way. Alan, how do you feel about being angry? What are you angry about? Well, the problem is that oftentimes our culture teaches us to fear anger, especially women. You're not supposed to be angry. As soon as you're angry, you become hysterical, right? That's what people say. Well, let's call them on that. No, you have right to be angry. Why do you have right to be angry? You know what? Do y'all remember that passage in the Gospel of John where Jesus drives out the money changers from the temple? Do you remember that? I see some heads maybe nodding. Yeah. Do you know right before what he did right before that? He wove that whip together. Do you know how long it takes to weave a whip together? It takes at least an hour, right? Let's say that. It takes a while. What is he thinking about as he's doing that? I think he's thinking about the money changers. How do you think he's feeling when he's doing that? I think he's feeling angry. You think as he's continuing to weave, do you think he's getting more and more angry? I think so. I think he's getting more and more angry about what they're doing to his father's house. Yeah, Jesus was angry. Anger is an appropriate emotion. It's a good emotion. Anger is different from fury. Fury is a fire that will burn you up and consume you. It will burn you out. If you're a leader who's consistently angry, you're not going to be a leader very long. Or furious in that way, you're not going to be a leader very long. But if you're angry in this way, if you understand the reasons and the causes for your anger, you're going to be clear-sighted and focused. You're not going to be furious, and you're not going to be quote unquote hysterical.
So to continue with the illustration, I really, really love this. It's something that I hadn't thought about. I don't know if that's a Kansas thing to know how long it takes to weave a
No,
whip,
I mean, I don't know.
but to continue with the illustration and to apply it to what we were just talking about before that with organizing, you've got to have an anger that sustains you through a period of building up capacity, right? You've got to be frustrated enough about the problem that you want to address to
Yes.
not just flail in anger and fury, but to weave something together to address that. And so, if we are thinking about to take it back to the mechanics of community organizing, it's finding those other communities, those other organizations of people that are angry about the same things that you're angry about, and weaving yourselves together. Right, with congregation, one hopes is already woven together through years of relationship and trust. We can always be working on that, but once we've established that, to then take that thread and weave it together with another thread and another thread and another thread to form this cord to address this injustice. And that's where in my experience, that's where it's important to ask questions about self-interest, right? Like, so that we're not acting from a charity mindset. You use the word solidarity a lot.
Yeah.
Uh, so we're not going to help out people who are not like us, but so that we are acting together with people who are like us,
Yeah.
even across those differences, that these threads get woven together. So you talked a minute about house meetings there. I want to go back and just pick up on what that is, because I know that's an important word. That's a
Sure.
new word for a lot of us.
Yeah.
Or house parties, I think is what they're called. But is it kind of like a group one-on-one, or what is it?
Yeah, I mean, so in my experience, so each of the different national networks do this a little bit differently. The way that I was trained in this is that if you're starting to organize a congregation, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to do a series of one-on-ones, right? So you're going to do a fair amount. You're going to talk to a lot of people in the congregation. And then at a certain point, you're going to do house meetings, right? Which is that you're going to call small groups together at congregants' houses. This worked particularly well within the Catholic institutions. Why did it work really well? Because the Catholics understood that congregations are parishes, which means that each individual congregation was responsible for the larger neighborhood, the larger city, several city blocks. That was its parish. So that was what it actually cared for. So it was really a community congregation in that way. For many white Protestant churches, that's difficult nowadays because so many are commuter churches, right? You've got many different neighborhoods that are represented here. But this principle still holds true, right? And it still works well, which is that you gather a group of your congregation together at someone's house, and you have a conversation that's story directed around the issues that are presenting to people. So say it's on schools, or say it's on transportation. And the key here is to turn the key moment is to do two things, right? The first is to show people that they're not alone, is to allow people to break out of their isolation, because that is where we are now. This is why one-on-ones are so effective, is because people are consistently thinking, this problem has got to be my own, right? No one else has this. I'm the only one who's I'm the only one who can solve this. And bootstrap theology, right here, pulling yourselves by your bootstraps, just
Mhm.
consistently pervades our broader Christian consciousness about how it is that we need to enact Christian ethics. You know, it's a sort of, and it gets moralized too. So then if you fail, it's your fault. If you're
Mhm.
poor, it's your fault. All these sorts of things. And I think that's wrong for on a basic sociological and political and economic analysis. But also the second point. So the first point here of breaking you out of your isolation. The second point is this adage of taking private pain and turning it into public action, which is a little different from isolation, right? Instead, it's to have Betty share the story with Judy so that both of you can feel and empathize with each other in a way that builds empathy and solidarity and relationships, that you are in this together, that you are both, that you share this problem, but also then that you're going to take the pain and you're going to alleviate it together by making it public and by bringing it out into public. Because why? Because you refuse the narrative that it's your fault. You refuse the narrative that it's you're the alone responsible for this, right? So things around education, things again, right? If politics are about the goods that we hold in common here, these things are not therapy sessions, right? This is not about quote unquote personal or private, or familial matters. Instead, it's about actual common goods. So the realm here is pretty. This is as on one way when people do the interviews or people do the one-on-ones and do it in an interview fashion, they treat it like therapy, you know, where you're just here to kind of receive, or they treat it like chit chat. It's neither of those things. Instead, it's a value-directed, intentional conversation about the stories that ground people's sacred values, what it is that people hold most dear, what do they care most about, who taught them. House meetings do that in larger groups and are thematically focused around issues and are directed towards developing issue campaigns so that a congregation can select the relevant issues and take action on them together and begin to build up. And typically what's the action? Research. Because you'll discover first off that you don't understand the issue completely at the city level. What's the current policy conditions? How did they get there? Who's the person responsible for putting forward that policy? What happens if we get it passed at the local level? Can the state, if you're here in Tennessee, we get housing things passed at Nashville, but the state shoots them down, right? So it's all about research. It's all about understanding. It's all about gaining and educating yourselves. Once you've done that, then you do a power analysis. Who are the institutions of power in the city? How do we understand them? Who do we need to talk to about this? And then once you've done that power mapping, then you have good, accountability sessions with the people who make the decisions. And this is different. I didn't say power holders. I said decision makers. Because that's key. The mayor, in this sense, is not necessarily a power holder. You are the power holders, right? Because power is what? Organized people, organized money, who have the capacity to act with efficacy. You elect that mayor. He just makes the decisions, or she makes the decisions, excuse me. So I do think it's like once this process then of building it up, you've got to, talk to people, select an issue, do a basic power mapping, educate yourselves, talk to others.
So to flesh this out with a concrete example,
Mm,
this cascading ladder of engagement that you're talking about, it starts uh with Peggy and I having a conversation about what are the things that are frustrating or challenging, and we learned that that it's really hard to get to certain places by car because there's not enough parking, but it's
mm,
also hard to get there other ways because the transit system isn't reliable, or there's not enough routes, or there's something unsafe happening in and around the bus stop. And maybe before that, Peggy was thinking, oh, I just need to find another way to get from A to B or to get to my appointments, or I need to just stop having those appointments. But it's
Yeah.
when when she had a conversation with me and I have a similar problem, and then I have a conversation with Betty and Betty has a similar problem, and Betty has a conversation with Todd who has a similar problem.
Right.
And suddenly we have this group discussion about the different lenses we have on transit safety or transit access. This becomes a house meeting, and we start realizing that Woodland Park Presbyterian really cares about transit access. And then we can start, as you were saying, like researching why are these things the way that they are? Who are the stakeholders? Is it something that has to do with maybe our council persons up here in North Seattle have really disinvested for several terms in a row from transit because they see it as not a problem for their district. And so we want to understand what are the policies around how transit changes happen and who are the decision makers. And
Yeah.
then once we know who the decision makers are, we say, are there other people in our neighborhood who have this same problem? And do we want to talk to them about it? Is that kind of how that
Yeah.
moves?
I mean, I think you nailed it. I mean, I think that the trick here is, I think the question is, uh, what does this have to do with my Christian faith? Right. This is a great like political strategy. Uh, and I think that the trick here is laying it out in that schematic condenses the time frame so that you think that everything happens in 6 months. But actually, that first step of those relational meetings, of those conversations, of listening and discerning, that's a continual process. You never stop doing that. You are always listening and you are always talking to others, right? Because God is consistently moving. How many of you ever saw the UCC's, God is still speaking, right? With the comma. Like
Would
that
love to
is
steal it.
real. Yeah. God is consistently speaking and moving, right? And changing things. And you, as a Christian, have to be attentive to discern God's movement in the world, right? And so then this process then of everything, step 2, 3, 4, 5, of finding others, educating yourselves, doing a power mapping, building an issue campaign, um, actually creating the conditions in which you can then take action on an issue, right? Because you may care about transportation, but it might be the case that there's no actual, like, the political timing is off. There's no ballot, say, or something like that. For this, there's not a transit measure coming up, but it will come up next year. All right, so we need to then think about longer than that. But if you don't ground your organizing in the relationships and values that are the root of organizing in the first place, it's going to be superficial. And it's just going to be about the issues. And it's not going to be about the values and the stories about who it is that God is calling you to be as a Christian or as a church. When it's fundamentally grounded in your identity as a Christian, that's when it's different. Because Christian identity, then again, and the church's identity is about the work of building relationships of liberation and love. That's what it's about. That's what we find in the Bible. That's what we find in the church fathers. That's what we find in our confessions. That's what we find in our book of order. That's why our polity is the way that it is. It's because it's consistently about setting up our bureaucratical institutional churches in ways that live out relationships of liberation and love. But the final thing to say about this too, like, and I want to kind of get there, and when oftentimes I talk with because my parents still live in the small town in Kansas, they get a little nervous about it. I'm not political, like I don't want to be an activist or something like this. One of the best stories that I've heard about doing a listening campaign in this first process, which again is the consistent process. You're always listening. You're always talking to each other because God is always moving, right? Things are always changing. People hurt for different reasons. you need to be there listening to each other, is that when a congregation finally went through the listening process, what they ended up doing is they decided that what they needed to do was rip out the red carpet, because that was what prevented them from inviting other people to their church.
Mm.
It wasn't something outlandish. They weren't out there with bullhorns. But what they did is they took an action that allowed them to feel their sense of agency, that they could do something, that they could make a change in their church. That's what it's about. That's a great place to start. Internal actions are great. It's not about, walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge right away. King had to get Montgomery first, right? And then Albany happened, and Albany was hard. So I mean, just look at the way that how it is that, like, yes, start small, get a sense of your agency, get a win, right? Which is, get a stop sign, or better yet, have a conversation about who it is that God is calling you to be as a congregation, and who God is calling you to be out in public, and what that means, right? Because God is still moved. God is, I'm sure things have changed.
Well, and saying no to that story of everything needing to be big, really needing to be flashy. We live in
Right.
a capitalist and a television saturated
Yeah.
world, where if it's not big, if it's not newsworthy, it's hard to imagine that it's worth doing. And yet, I love the story about the carpet, that it's building that muscle, right? Like,
Yes.
as you said, they didn't get the Edmund Pettus Bridge in a month.
No.
That was the culmination, and that was one stop along a story
Yeah.
of people living their faith and asking what is the obligation of our faith in this moment, and doing it again and again and again. But they did all start with something in their community, in their neighborhood, perhaps in their building.
Yes. And this is really important too. It takes a village, right? I don't know if how many of y'all know the Enneagram? Do you know what that is? The personality tests? Because show of hands, does anybody know what the Enneagram is? All right, Todd does. All right, so Todd, what's the Enneagram? I've been talking a lot, so let's shift it up here. Unmute yourself. There you go.
I have a pretty not a big understanding of what it is, but it's a way of identifying personalities through a number, assigning a number to personality, and 1 through 9, maybe.
Yeah, sure. Exactly.
And each one, it's outgoing or not, it's public, it's quiet, it's
Yeah.
get along with others, don't get along with, there's lots of facets, and you arrive at this number through a series of questions and a process that then I haven't done it. I would like to, but I imagine you fill this thing out and somehow arrive at a 1-digit number.
That's right. So I am a 1 on the Enneagram, which is I'm a perfectionist, right? Well, I don't really know if I am, but that's what the tests have told me. And a useful example here is that the 3s are the people who love to be out in front, right? Love to be out there with a bullhorn. That's not me. I'm not a 3, right? So really, you don't want me out there, out in front. You want me behind the scenes. You want me as the person who's like building the organization, doing the administrative work, right? And this is true for all of us. We each bring different gifts. Some of us love to be out in front, should be out in front. Thank God for you, right? Other people need to be behind the scenes, building and doing that relational work and making sure that everything like holds the truth. This is probably true of your own congregation. Somebody's probably there every Sunday morning setting up coffee at 6 a.m. before Pastor Joe gets there. Somebody's probably like, clean things up after Wednesday evening church. I don't know. I'm just kind of making up the life of your church here, but each of you play different roles, and that's a good thing. And there's little reason besides the fact that you should not allow fear and the status quo to keep you in those roles, to keep you in a role that you should not be in, right? It's important to grow and to test yourself. So, Alan, I'm going to ask you in our one-on-one what you're angry about. And if you're cowering from that and be like, how do you feel about angry? I'm going to try and push you a little bit, right? To wake you up. But also, each of us have different gifts. So sometimes we need to rip out the red carpet, and sometimes we need to be out in front of City Hall.
So I'm gonna kind of give a signpost as to where we're going next. I think we're gonna have a little time for questions in a moment here, but um, Aaron's given us a introduction to broad-based community organizing and an introduction to some of the theological underpinnings of why we would do it and what's happening as we do it. We're going to meet again in 2 weeks, this time, this day of the week, to continue the conversation. At that time, we're going to be talking about really narrowly focused on storytelling. Storytelling as something we do when we're building power, something we do when we're understanding our world, and we're telling the story of that world. And it's power when we witness to it and when we tell our story. The next time we meet after that, which is going to be July 8th, again on Monday, again 7 o'clock, we're going to jump in even a little bit more granularly to the mechanics of that one-to-one conversation. And it's always this tension, right, Aaron, between the theological and living out those values and understanding the mechanics of it. Because if you just have a conversation about values, it can be kind of sloppy. But if you use this framework, you can provide a little bit of structure, some helpful conflict, and a little helpful tension to keep that going.
That's right.
So we're gonna pull all those things together and try to equip folks for thinking, one, about the relational meetings that we've had in the past. Woodland Park has had a relational meeting season. I know that Northminster Pres has been really trying to reach out and connect with the community around them as well. And Woodland Park right now is in the midst of this exploratory phase with our Property with Purpose team, doing that same thing, trying to connect with neighbors, trying to get an understanding of the stories of who we've been in the community and what's happening around us. So equipping us for that to not just reflect on what we learned in the past, but to go and have more learning in the future in those one-on-one conversations. Is going to be that last meeting. We've been kind of all over the map. It's been a great conversation about the mechanics and the theology of organizing. I know we're about at the end of the time that we advertised. Are there any questions that folks have? This is not going to be the last time to talk. June, I see your hand.
Well, I just wanted to know what was the small town you came from?
Oh, sure. Iola, Iola.
Okay, because I have family who came from Moran.
Oh,
Kansas
goodness
now.
gracious.
So I got all kinds of shirt tail relatives back there.
It's
So
15 miles away from my hometown. Look at that.
yeah,
It's a small world.
you're right.
It's a small world. Yeah. Huh.
A question. So with the discussion and the house parties or the house meetings that
Yeah.
where you're trying to figure out as a community what's the thing you want to do or the place you want to be involved or the activity you'd want to do, whether it's put a stop sign in or rip out the red carpet, whatever the idea is. I mean, so people come to those unavoidably with preconceived notions, this is what we should do.
Mm.
And at the end of those conversations, something is chosen. And likely most of the people aren't really totally bought into the idea that came out of the meeting, even though it was a joint decision. How do you keep those people interested?
Yeah, I mean, I think in two things here. So a house meeting in this way is primarily not a point of choosing a framework for action. It's to do two things, right? Which is to break people out of their isolation and to turn private pain into public action. Right? Which is to again put people into relationship and say, no, we wanna begin to take action on it. What the actual, concrete steps then are not decided at that point, because you're in a circle and you're sharing the stories around education, you're sharing the stories around healthcare, and you say, we need to take action on it. Okay, so what should we do? Well, we're not going to decide it here today. Instead, we're going to form a committee that's going to research and educate and get a good understanding about what the conditions of the organizing, how it is that we came to be. And then furthermore, what are the various opportunities that might be out there for you? Because conditions change. As I said, I mean, with this, so one of the example that we use is that we held in San Antonio, we held house meetings around an education bond. Why did we do that? Well, because an education bond was up before the community for that year. And so we needed to turn out people to vote if the community supported the bond, and they did. So we needed to turn out people, and the bond passed, right? People cared about education, the following years and 2 years before, but they just didn't have the right political moment to act for change. So the pragmatic decisions of political action are a second step from the first step. From step 0 of building relationships, and then step 1 of actually sharing those stories with others to build a network and a common platform from which action can be taken. Does that make sense?
It does. The concern, kind of the gist of the question is,
when do you decide?
At some point there will be a decision on something to do.
Yeah.
Some action to get involved with, some process in the community that needs some work.
Yeah.
And
so
not everyone's going to think that's a great idea because they said, no, I think we should be going and doing this other thing.
Right.
So how do you keep that person interested enough to do what their church is doing when they think it should be something else?
I mean, this is where it returns back to Joe's point around self-interest, right?
Yeah.
Is that you've got to have a clear understanding. Again, self-interest is not selfishness. Self-interest allows you, that's right, Antonio, we can talk about that here in a second. But a self-interest, if you're clear about your self-interest, you have a clear understanding about how it is, what the relationship between the issues and the values are. What are the various issues that are presented in front of you in the political landscape? And what are the values that ground your concern with those various issues, right? This is where I'm vested in this. And then furthermore, you have a clear understanding about how that connects you to others, because you're self among others. So it's about having that clear relationship. As long as you are grounding the organizing in relationships that are rooted in those stories and those values with others, which is for this, then I have to know why Antonio, say, cares about education, say. I have to know that he has a kid, say, named Stephen. I'm just making this up, Antonio. But I want to know more about Stephen. And I want to know, Stephen's having trouble in school. I want to know why and what's going on and how long that's been going on and what support Antonio has at home, or in the community, or all sorts of things. Yeah, it might be the case that, passing the particular political action that presents itself might not be the panacea for Antonio's situation, but it might help him a little bit. And then furthermore, what happens after that? I say, hey, Antonio, this is really great. It's nice how we can get a win for you, and this is great. But now we can build power. When we get one win, we can go and get more wins, which means that we can get more wins for you and for Stephen and for others. because, as Antonio noted, we're not a one-issue community. We're not a single-issue community, right? Because there are many different things that we're concerned about. So again, if you're grounding the organizing in relationships and not in issues, if you're grounding this in the faith of building of your Christian identity as doing the work of building relationships of liberation and love, you're doing it because you love people. People will stick in it because of the relationships, not because of the issues, because the issues will fade. The issues consistently change, but the values don't. That's what keeps you in there. That's what keeps you in the fight. So this is a really good question. And it's, I think, consistently the confusion, which is, well, some people don't agree with me about my, tactic for solving this issue. It's not about the issues. I mean, it's not only about the issues. I mean, yeah, I'm going to say this far. It's not about the issues. It's about the values and relationships.
Well,
Because
and the issue is not the
what it's about.
motive thing. It's the desire to build power to address in relationship to address your needs, to address my needs. That it's a collective project. Sorry, I jumped in on you there, Aaron.
No, I mean, I think that's right. I'm an academic, right? So I want to make sure that I'm speaking clearly here. But it's like, yeah, it's about me getting to know Antonio and me understanding Antonio's story. And then us saying, Antonio, yeah, I'm pissed with you. Let's do something about it. I think God is calling us to do something about it as a congregation. And this is what it's about to be the church. The church isn't defined by one issue. The church is called to a particular task, building relationships of love and liberation.
Well, and this is one of the key differences between what congregations do and what broad-based community organizing does versus a political campaign.
Yeah.
As someone who's been a part of both of those.
Yeah.
With a political campaign, you're charting a course from A to B, and the person whose job it is to write that course, to write that strategy is in charge. And if you don't like it, go find another campaign.
That's right.
This campaign is doing. Whereas with broad-based community organizing, it's starting with those stories, starting with those relationships. I'm doing this
Yes.
work not because I'm getting paid or because I'm part of a group that has a single issue, but as Antonio pointed out in the chat, that we're part of a community.
Amen.
And so that means that when we see the moment rising up to address this thing, we're going to go do that. And then when later on, when there's a moment to address maybe my personal issue of passion, that trust and that ability to mobilize, that muscle, that infrastructure is then developed to go and address that other moment.
Yeah.
But we do it together, and we do it from those values of faith, those values of community, as opposed to just this stripped down kind of analytical concept of what's the fastest from A to B.
Yeah, don't let your politics determine your faith.
We had a conversation about that earlier today in scripture conversation.
Yeah, I mean, why should this is what we're consistently facing is we have electoralitis. We are sick of elections because they are determining consistently what it is we think politics is about, or more than this, what our faith is about. It's the other way around, right? Let your faith determine your politics, or at least influence it. Who are you called to be? Yeah. Finley, I'm curious here. Go ahead. What is this comment here? Oh, you're muted.
I should warn you, Aaron, Finley is one of our resident comics here.
Oh, you're muted. You're muted. Can't hear you.
There we are. It's not entirely in jest. It refers back to your recollection of Jesus driving the money changers from the temple and with a whip, and it's a parody of an old saying.
So for anyone watching this later, the comment is, "Oh, what a tangled whip we weave when first we settle our own pet peeve."
Yeah.
Thanks, Finley.
My pleasure.
I love it.
Any other questions from all of you that are here? This won't be our last time to have this conversation. Won't be our last time to ask questions of Aaron. Aaron, I wonder if you have any last stories or a parting message for us.
No, I think that well, so I'm an ordained minister of word and sacrament in the PCUSA, and one of the things that I, in order to get ordained, as Joe knows, you have to take the ordination exams, and you have to read the Constitution, right, the Book of Order. And one of the parts that I found sort of most moving were the chapters in our Constitution about the church and about how it is that the church is called to the community. I think one of the things that's really inspiring about good Reformed Presbyterian theology is this is there. It's in our book. It's in your creeds. It's theologically there for us. The challenge, I think, is for us to take it up and make it our own. And that takes a little bit of courage, because I think we're often used to having people chew our own food for us. And so I think part of this is like, okay, let's actually kind of step out and get a little bit okay with being uncomfortable, and maybe, thinking about why it is you are angry at certain points, or, not about certain things, and doing that self-reflection. This work is hard work. It's slow and patient work. I think that's the other thing to say about it. You're not going to get to Edmund Pettus Bridge tomorrow. You may not ever. But the point is that for you to be laying a foundation and to be contributing to a relational culture that makes that possible. Because if you don't, others are. That's the thing, is that there are actively others who understand this and are a little bit more. The right has always done a better job at building power than the left has.
In other words, it's ongoing work.
Yeah, it's ongoing work, right? Thanks, Betty. That's exactly right.
Well, with that,
right.
Let's thank you, Aaron, so much for joining us tonight. We look forward to having you back in 2 weeks and continuing this conversation with storytelling, with the power of telling our story, listening to others' story, and just what comes up in midst of that. Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight.
Yeah. Be well all.
Thanks, Aaron.